Hi, I'm Funk McLovin. Subscribe for more essays.
Back here again, can't get enough. Jojo explains some interesting stuff.
Hi there, my name's Jojo. Here's a disclaimer before this video starts. This is about democracy in the USA. This is not an argument for democracy. This is an analysis of the democracy as it exists in the United States. So that is the point of this essay. I don't want anyone to get off track. This is probably the most serious video essay I've done since like the capitalist video. So all my sources and whatnot are in the description of the video. So if anything's wrong, let me know in the comments. I don't want to see a bunch of arguments, but telling people that on the internet means pretty much nothing. So anyway, here we go. Democracy. In the United States, democracy is touted as a national value. From the learnings done in elementary school, quotes from the Founding Fathers like no taxation without representation. After all, the USA is a representative democracy, a democracy where we elect leaders to represent us in lawmaking bodies. That's all in theory anyway. But how democratic is the representative democracy which we live under? How well do the elected officials represent their constituents? Who are these people? The question is pressing, since the government was constructed with these values in mind. Democracy is the whole point, the layman being represented by the government who the collective hypothetically controls. The long-touted concept that the American people are the true bosses of government officials. First, how do we measure the success of democracy? There are myriad ways, depending on your philosophy, of course, but let's be specific. Since this is the broadest topic, I'd like to choose the national government, i.e. the three branches, judicial, executive, and legislative. For those of us joining who don't remember elementary school studies, here's the rundown. Executive. One president, elected once per 4 years. Presidents appoint a vice president, a cabinet, and a chief justice. He has semi-final approval on all laws and makes decisions about the executions of laws. Judicial, 9 justices. They're not elected and they serve until they die, retire, or are removed from office. The legislative branch approves candidates that the president selects. Legislative. Congress with 2 houses, the House of Representatives constituting 435 voting representatives and 6 non-voting members. The representative serves for 2 years. They each represent 1 district in the USA. The Senate constituting of 100 seats plus the seat of the vice president appointed by the president. The vice president does not vote except to break ties. Each congressman co-represents a state with 1 other congressman who serves staggered terms of 6 years. What Congress actually does, very loosely, is write laws. This is all according to Capitol.gov. Quote, Article 1. The longest article in the Constitution describes congressional powers. Congress has the power to make laws, declare war, raise and provide public money and oversee its proper expenditure, impeach and try federal officers, approve presidential appointments, approve treaties negotiated by the executive branch, and oversight investigations. In the executive and legislative branches, each member is chosen by a direct election, quote-unquote, but some states have the option for the governor to choose representatives while seats are filled. Term limits vary in Congress. Now that everyone is appraised of the duties and the composition of each branch, let's talk about how all this pertains to the main question, the question of democracy. Democracy, the word, comes from the Greek demokratia, which literally means power in the people's hands. Specifically, the idea that each citizen has a hand in the decision-making in government. This is opposed to a system such as a dictatorship where only one individual has sole power, or monarchy, a king's dynasty who rules through heredity. One main difference between the democracy as a concept is it can be applied to things other than forms of government, as opposed to monarchies or dictatorships. Democratic processes are used in the private sector as well, through methods like unions and workplace democracy, for instance, co-determination laws in Germany, as well as companies like the Spanish worker cooperative Mondragon. More specifically to the United States, this means that each individual has some kind of say in its government. There are lots of kinds of democracy, such as direct democracy, where every law is voted upon by people, or representative democracy, where people vote on their leaders, which the USA and many other countries in the world use, such as Britain, Germany, and India, to name a few. So if democracy is the involvement of the individual in the government, then, theoretically speaking, it's easy to devise a metric on which we can judge democracy. There could even be a few. 1. How well is each individual person's vote represented by the results of elections? 2. How well are individuals' beliefs and opinions represented by the decisions of elected officials? And 3. How much access do laymen have to voting? Since there are a variety of elections in the USA, these questions have many answers. For this, let's stick to specifically presidential and congressional races in the USA on a national scale. In other words, don't worry about governors or state congresspersons. Part 1. How well is each individual person's vote represented by the results of elections? Voting is a simple process on the individual level. Someone makes a decision on a seat of government. Those of you who have voted before are clear on the process. Choose the representative you want. In a theoretical election between two candidates, the voter has two options, candidate 1 and candidate 2. The candidate with more votes wins. However, there is one additional extra option, not voting. This is often undiscussed, but it's important, since people who do not vote are subject to be represented by the same people who do vote. Donald Trump is the president of those who voted and of those who didn't vote. Notably, Donald Trump is also the president of the people who did not vote for him. The question above for Congress is fairly straightforward. Since each congressperson is elected directly, i.e. through an election where the highest number of votes decides the outcome, the answer is simple. For Congress, whoever more individuals choose to vote for wins the election. And since each individual person can only belong to one state and one district, there are no chances for individuals to have more than one vote. Simple, right? Well, there's a small issue. Districts and states. The two houses of Congress have different numbers of members, each hailing from different swaths of land. Each district has a representative in the House, and each Senate has two representatives in the Senate. This caused some problems. For instance, Rhode Island has a population of about 1 million, and California has a population of about 40 million. This means that if everyone in these states voted, Rhode Island voters would have 40 times the voting power of those in California. It also means that the California senators would have the power over the vote of 40 times the amount of people in their body of government. This is a huge problem. You might be imagining that in this case, the House of Representatives is better off, since they operate with smaller units. You'd be right, the discrepancy is much, much closer, but massive in some cases. For instance, the just shy of 1 million in Montana at large versus Rhode Island's 1st District with 526,000. So the answer is complicated. The House is certainly closer to ideal since its discrepancy in representation is lower, as opposed to the population arbitrary boundaries of states. But the Senate constitutes half of Congress's power. On an election-to-an-election basis, it's true that each individual gets one vote, but those votes have vastly different weights depending on where you live. The question is, does this matter? Is a group disproportionately represented? The answer is a resounding yes. States and districts with more individuals have diluted voting power, and urban centers in general have less voting power in both houses of Congress. This means that smaller states and districts who need fewer votes to win will be overrepresented. There's a lot of apologism as to why this is. Many people say it is to preserve the vote of, say, the farmer who has more land and a lower population, but this is at best antiquated and at worst untrue. The question is simple. How well is each individual person's vote represented by the results of elections? And the answer is simple. Poorly, particularly in the U.S. Senate. Smaller areas tend to be more homogeneous in terms of race, ethnicity, and beliefs, which is why smaller states often have similar voting trends. Since we're a representative democracy, it's difficult to make a system that's absolutely perfect, that represents every person equally. And some would argue that the point is not to represent each person equally, but to represent each state equally. You could argue that, but for each step you take away from the power of the individual person, you take away from the idea of democracy itself. Personally, in my opinion, states are arbitrary. A state should not have power. The people within those states should possess the power. A state in its entirety is not an entity capable of singular willpower. It has no place in democracy. Now, on to presidential elections. Oh, hello, the Electoral College. What's that? You're going to make my video essay even longer? Oh no! So, might as well rip the fucking band-aid off. The Electoral College. Okay, so, the presidential election is not a direct election. U.S. viewers will be familiar with this. The winner of the election is not decided by individual votes, it is decided by the decisions of electors. Basically, each elector represents a seat in Congress. That's why I covered Congress first. See what I'm doing here? There are 538 electors, 2 for each state and 1 for each district. For instance, Michigan has 2 electors for Senate and 14 for each district. When an individual person votes, their vote has a few purposes. The 2 state electors vote as the state did. For instance, if A gets 50 votes and B gets 51, those 2 electoral votes are given to B. The other electors are broken down into districts. So if B gets the state 2 votes, if a district votes A 14, B 13, A will win that electoral vote, sort of. This also means that states with 1 district, like Montana, have 3 votes that are all decided by direct popular vote. However, most states have a rule where the state's popular votes gets all the electoral votes. In other words, even in districts that voted A, their elector would vote B if B wins the Senate. Confused yet? Furthermore, to win, a president needs a so-called absolute majority of electoral votes, or 270, which is only 1 more than half 269. So, in sum, to win a presidential race, a president needs at least 50.19% of the electoral votes. This has the same problems that I talked about before. Since states have disproportionate representation, people in smaller states have more voting power than people in larger states. The larger the state, the more the vote is diluted. This could also lead to a president being elected who has not won the popular vote. In fact, this has happened. Recently in 2016, Hillary Clinton earned 2.1 more of the popular vote, and in 2000, Al Gore earned 0.5% more. In the latter case, Bush lost Florida, a decisive state, by just 500 votes. The issue with this, then, is demonstrable. Since the vote is once again split by states, smaller states have clear advantage. Voters in larger states have smaller individual power, and despite their entire state having more sway, they have less control in the election at large. For instance, again, Montana's 1 million people decide 3 electoral votes, where California's 40 million decide 55 electoral votes. To be proportionate by population, California would have to have 120 electoral votes, or Montana would only have to have 3/4 of 1 electoral vote. At first glance, it might seem like California has more power, but this is far from true. California itself might have more power, but her people do not. California is not a person and should have no place in representative democracy. But it doesn't end there, folks. Let's talk about faithless electors. For the uninformed, electors in the Electoral College aren't just votes, they are people who cast those votes. Basically, a faithless elector can overrule the vote in their state and vote for who they like anyway. In 2016, there were 10, 7 of which successfully swapped their votes. 8 electors pledged to the Clinton-Kaine ticket, changed their vote to a different candidate, and 2 changed from Trump to another candidate. There's a fine in many states for this, but in some there are not. This, of course, is completely undemocratic. The idea that a representative proxy of the vote towards a representative can just change a group's vote is completely asinine. The fact that electors are individuals whatsoever is absolutely ridiculous. Granted, this occurs in less than 1% of the time, but the fact that it is an option and not subject to a fine in many states present a lot of unsavory potential against the democratic system. So, bad news. The election system in the US is not democratic. There are myriad flaws and many voters can be unequal. In presidential races, the answer is simple. Simply weigh each person's vote against another. Make the election direct. Beyond this, you can make rules like a necessary absolute majority or a certain threshold of voters to win, but as it stands, the process isn't fair to the voters inside the USA. Again, like I said before, I'm sure there are reasons to have the Electoral College, but many reasons are not democratic. Any system that weighs individuals unequally is by definition different than democracy. While it's true that every citizen has the opportunity to vote, they do not have the opportunity to vote equally. For Congress, the answer is more difficult. Theoretically, if there was one Congress each representing a district that had an equal number of constituents, that would be appropriate. Even an approximately equal number would be better what we have now. A step such as removing the Senate would make things more equal, as the House experiences less discrepancy. Unfortunately, land should not vote, point blank. A state or district-based system puts emphasis on arbitrary areas to make laws. The best system, then, would not to bother with states or districts at all. Simply vote for a group of individuals without respect to land, or have the people vote directly on laws. The argument against this system is simple. It goes against the principle that there are fears that rural areas might be underrepresented in government, the farmers in particular, or that the national government might make a decision that is fine for many states, but not for others. To this, too, there are solutions that don't involve land-based voting systems. One idea is that an individual only has voting rights to the things that directly affect them. For instance, individuals without a womb being unable to vote on abortion. The confirmation process for this would be lengthy, but another idea would be to put considerably more power into smaller and smaller governments, allowing local governments to make choices that suit their needs. A less top-down structure in favor of one that's more lateral, based in communities rather than land. Again, however, this system we have is antiquated and deeply flawed. I don't think it takes that much to demonstrate this. Part 2. How well are individuals' beliefs and opinions represented by the decisions of elected officials, and how much access do laymen have to voting? So we've established that the USA's democracy has some fatal flaws. All of this, of course, is theoretical. In other words, if America is running fine, what does it matter that there are some flaws? Well, other than the example in the previous section concerning times when presidents have been elected without the popular vote, what are the functional, non-theoretical problems with this system? In the previous segment, we talked about voting as though voting itself was a hypothetically perfect democratic system. However, in the beginning, we discussed how there are large swaths of people who do not vote at all, who have their representatives chosen for them. Let's take this example from the 2016 presidential election. In the USA in 2016, there were approximately 238 million people eligible to vote. Of those, 138 million Americans chose to vote, which is about 58.1%. This means that 41.9% of people who could have voted did not. There are a variety of reasons a person might vote, and one might imagine that 40% of the population simply chose not to vote. This, of course, is not the case. The window for voting is very small. There are absentee options taken by 36% of voters in 2012, but those options vary by state. To most people, in-person voting is the only option available to them. This means that there are many people who cannot have access to their polling place, or might like to vote but do not have the ability to. It's impossible to guess at specific numbers, but the possibility and a narrow window for the vast majority of voters is demonstration enough. Besides a small voting window, requirements in many states have a cutoff point when, before an election, you can register to vote. Only 16 states offer same-day registration, meaning eligible voters in most states cannot vote unless registered earlier. The argument is this lowers voter fraud, and voter fraud is certainly a threat to democracy, but preventing fraud is a much smaller problem than increasing voter accessibility. One way to decrease fraud is to decrease the fraud threshold. For instance, each person who can prove their identity, citizenship, and age on voting day should be allowed to vote. A simple verification process means it is easier to identify fraud, theoretically. Frankly, I don't know how rampant voter fraud in the US is. Since it's a very fraught topic right now, finding data on it is difficult, but I maintain that access to voting is incredibly slim. Let's crunch some numbers. Of the 138 million individuals who did vote, 66 million voted for Clinton and 63 million voted for Trump. This means that 27% of eligible voters voted Hillary, 26% of eligible voters voted Trump, and about 7% voted independent, and 41% didn't vote. All numbers are approximate to the million. That's kind of weird, right? Sure, if you only count voters, Donald and Hillary got 48 and 46% respectively, but counting all possible voters, the winner was no one. 41% either chose not to vote or could not vote. This demonstrates a huge issue. Democracy doesn't work if only some people vote. Suffrage movements for women and black people were huge in the US. The right isn't enough. Participation is also an issue. Sure, choosing not to vote could imply no preference, but most likely it implies that there's a huge swath of the population that wanted to vote but was unable to. Why should 1/4 of a voting population be empowered to choose a president? This means that people's voices matter less than the people who happen to be able to get out to the polls. But again, this is all theoretical. A way to gauge if people's voices are being heard or by their representatives is by comparing data to election results. For instance, Donald Trump is currently our president, but 42% is Donald Trump's most recent approval rating as of September 13th, and on average he has a 40% since his term began. The previous Gallup averages are similarly dismal. The last president to have an average approval rating of over 50 was George W. Bush with 53%, and the only president to have 60 or higher was Bill Clinton. In a representative government, those scores are absolutely dismal. Theoretically, we elect representatives to represent our interests, and this is stark evidence that they are not and have not been for a long time. Congress's results are even worse, a current 20%. It hasn't even been above 30% since 2009. This is horrible. The reasons for this are very clear, a trend of polarization in politics that has made the USA a decades-long stalemate between two brands of million and billionaires. Wedge issues have driven this country in two, with another half choosing not to vote outright. The Congress nor the President has been representative of America in race nor in income. Politicians have become politicians, vying for power to shamelessly keep it. It's a game that requires excessive funds to win, and America be divided to continue. Politicians have begun to affect the people they serve instead of the other way around. We're not voting these people in. They've established caucuses and committees to keep and hold their power. This means that we're not allowed to choose the candidate we want, but at best the more lobbyable candidate, and at worst the lesser of two evils. People's beliefs have stopped reflecting in our representatives, and the layman either cannot vote 2/5 of the time or chooses not to. We're voting those with more appealing rhetoric, not the candidates with better connections to the facts. We are in an age where we need doctors, but we have been electing candy salesmen. This has been an examination of the national politics. As always, afterwards, I'm sure you're feeling exhausted. My apologies. I do, however, have a silver lining. As politics get more local, there are clear trends. Governor approval ratings are much higher, disapproval ratings lower still. The more local you go, the better the picture looks. Sure, it's not perfect everywhere, but locally issues have a greater chance of being heard. Many states have legalized weed. Many still have introduced same-day voting registration. The higher we build institutions of power, the more heavily they weigh upon us. If we rely on our neighbors first and our nation second, we'll be able to effect real, lasting change in the places where it truly, truly matters. The very least you can do to this end is vote local and look up local representatives. So at the end of this video, after all the doom and gloom, don't take away that everything is fruitless. Take away this. If you're able-bodied, if you're available, give your time to anything from as small as voting in local elections. You can make a difference. In 2016, I voted for same-day voter registration in my state. I helped make it happen. I gave a shit, and I know it's hard, but giving a shit is the only way you can pull your mood from all this doom, and giving a shit is the only way we can pull our asses out of this together. The only thing it takes to change the world is enough people giving a shit. Seriously, Google local elections and your city will have a page on it. Do it right after this video and comment on what you find. Find out what state reps are running on this ticket. Find out if your city group has a place you can volunteer. A good place to start is searching for socialist or democratic groups. Shill for Biden this November, but there is so much work to be done past that. I believe in you. Thanks for listening, everybody. If you're new here, go ahead and subscribe. If you're not new here, hello. It's good to see you. I have a Patreon if you'd like to submit to it. I'm doing a Song a Day project right now until the end of the year, and I'm also doing video essays. I'll be doing video essays for a long time. I will have my video essays up early for patrons as soon as I get enough people who involve themselves in my Patreon. Until then, shout out to Jojoro, who is my first ever patron. Thank you so much, and have a great day. Don't get discouraged. Don't be a doomer. No one likes them. See you soon.